In its worst form, vitamin A deficiency can lead to blindness and death. The WHO estimates that up to 500,000 children become blind every year with this deficiency, with half of them dying within 12 months of losing their sight. Now, some scientists have tried to target this problem with genetic engineering, specifically with this so-called golden rice. It's a strain of rice that produces vitamin A-rich beta-carotene. If poorer populations who suffer from such deficiency can adopt that rice as a staple, the argument goes, then it could solve or significantly reduce this lethal problem. Now, in practice, the initiative has been targeted by environmentalist campaigners, notably supported by Greenpeace. Just a couple of months ago, the decision by the Philippines government to license and ramp up production of golden rice was reversed via a court challenge by the campaigners. They celebrated the outcome as a victory for poor farmers and, of course, for the planet. But others stridently attacked it as an action that would needlessly condemn children to death. Now, those are weighty consequences either way. So, what's really going on? That's what this video is going to talk about. It has been a long time in the making. Golden rice was first conceived in the 1980s and introduced back in 2004. A rice variety that was produced by adding 2 genes from maize and a common bacterium from the soil into white rice. It resulted in a rice that behaved as normal in every way, except that it produced beta-carotene. And it was targeted at a real problem. Vitamin A deficiency has, as we've said, led to the deaths of millions of children in a number of poor countries, around 2 million of them in the early 1990s. Now, that problem has been being addressed with various programs over the decades, and it has seen progress. The number of deaths dropped to just over 100,000 by 2013, for instance. Now, that's still a lot. And while the total cases of deficiency have halved, there were still 490 million of them in the 30 years from 1990 to 2019. In the Philippines specifically, this included up to 2 million children under 5 affected by deficiency, according to the government's nutrition survey. So yes, a real problem. Which would be why the Philippines Department of Agriculture has been promoting the development of golden rice, issuing a biosafety permit for it that declared it as safe as conventional rice. They weren't alone in that. Food safety regulators in the United States, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand all came to broadly the same conclusion. In 2023, just 47 hectares were planted, as some growers tried out the rice to see how it would perform. The government aims for that to grow to 500,000 hectares in the next few years. But then it hit a pretty major bump in the road. A number of campaigners and environmentalists had taken the government's approval decision to court, arguing that the introduction of GM rice had been done in spite of the absence of robust safety data. In April, the court issued a so-called writ of nature, acknowledging the campaigners' concerns and blocking the initial rollout. Greenpeace celebrated the outcome, saying this: "This decision is a monumental win for Filipino farmers and Filipino people who have for decades stood up against genetically modified crops." Greenpeace commends this decision and is honoured to be part of a movement that supported this work, spearheaded by Filipino farmers who will ultimately benefit the most from the decision. Not everyone was so impressed, and indeed the environmentalist Mark Linus specifically turned against Greenpeace for its part in the outcome. He didn't mince his words. "If you donate money to Greenpeace," he said, "you might think you're helping to save the whales or the rainforests, but in reality you may be complicit in a crime against humanity." This is a devastating blow to the scientific community in the Philippines and the humanitarian groups who were hoping golden rice could be used to help save the lives of young children across Asia and Africa. I can't make a precise estimate, but assuming the chilling effect extends to similar efforts elsewhere in the developing world, the potential effect could be in the order of 100,000 avoidable child deaths per year. Unsurprisingly, the Filipino Department of Agriculture said that it was seeking the reconsideration of a decision which applied both to golden rice and separately to BT aubergines. And should that not be successful, it said it would take it all the way up to the country's Supreme Court. When you get an issue like this, with two very committed sides fighting for or against a novel technology, it's advisable to take the claimed consequences from either side with a pinch of salt. So, what is the sober assessment of where this is? After all, if all farmers were opposed to GM crops, as the campaigners imply, the rice would have no one interested in taking it up, which doesn't seem to be the case. So, what are the arguments both sides are making? What do they have behind them? Starting with the campaigners opposing golden rice, it comes down to a number of things, although I think one argument is really at the centre of their worries, which we'll come to a little bit later on. So they say that they believe that GM foods pose unspecified risks to health for the people consuming them. They invoke the precautionary principle, which suggests that the onus of proof should be on the producers of a new technology to prove it to be safe before it is permitted, rather than expecting opponents to have to prove it to be unsafe. They argue also that GM crops are used by major corporations to make life harder for poor farmers who can get sucked into buying expensive grain that cannot be kept and replanted from year to year, making them dependent on the companies and impoverishing them in the process. The campaigners don't deny that vitamin A deficiency is a problem, but they point to natural crops like sweet potatoes and squash and tomatoes that equally can provide that vitamin. If the government, they say, could bolster organic production of these vegetables, that's their preference of course, conventionally grown vegetables have vitamin A as well. If it could do that, it would be a better solution to the problem. Now, the supporters of golden rice take a different view. After all, they suggest vitamin A deficiency has been a problem for many decades. If these other solutions were so easy to make work in reality, you'd have to ask why they haven't solved the problem yet. The Philippine Society of Nutritionist Dietitians said this: for low-income households, rice would comprise as much as 80% or more of their caloric intake. If rice is the only food on the table for a family that cannot afford to buy fruits and vegetables, then it would help if that one food that they can afford and eat is able to provide vitamin A and other micronutrients to allow them to meet their daily nutrient requirements. That didn't mean, they said, that the government shouldn't promote those other vegetables and seek to distribute them. But while doing that, it would also be beneficial to have golden rice in the mix as well. According to the website Mongabay, public data shows that less than 5% of the country's agriculture is devoted to the organic farming that the campaigners favour. The lower yield associated with organic production is seen as a disincentive to its uptake, and there are significant barriers to obtaining organic certification for those products. As for the campaigners' fears about corporate interests, the proponents of golden rice point out that the technology has been freely donated for humanitarian use. No farmers will be prevented from replanting crops based on golden rice seed. It would not be used to bolster corporate profits. Full stop. And golden rice doesn't share some of the GM properties that the campaigners most often criticise. So some GMOs are modified to resist herbicides or pesticides. Golden rice doesn't. It behaves in every way like a conventional crop, save for the production of beta-carotene. This leads to the campaigners' remaining argument. and one that is probably the heart of their most potent fear. It's all very well, they say, that this specific GM crop is being freely given, but first, the Switzerland-based seed company Syngenta, which donated it and permits it to be reused season to season, that company still maintains full commercial rights over it. So there's no guarantee that as soon as it suits the company, those terms might not change. And that leads to the base point. This is being used, they argue, as the genetically modified Trojan horse to build acceptance amongst the population in developing countries for GM crops. The campaigners have long been resisting the technology, and their chief weapons have been the argument that modifications really benefit corporate profits, not consumers or farmers. And then secondly, that the commercial terms on which they will be sold will disenfranchise farmers who will not be able to replant seed from their crops. Here, they say, we have a variety that has been designed to sidestep both of those objections. It is demonstrably of humanitarian benefit. It is being donated to be freely used, for now anyway, by farmers. But the corporations, they're supporting it predominantly to get the population to accept the technology in principle, so they'll be better able to promote future crops that serve their interests more directly. This is the edge use case, the one that breaches the boundaries, pushes open the Overton window. Sarojini Rengam, Executive Director of Pesticide Action Network, made this case to the UK's Guardian newspaper, calling it, quote, a public relations stunt pulled by the agribusiness corporations to garner acceptance of genetically engineered crops and food. Efforts will be better placed, she suggested, restoring natural and agricultural biodiversity rather than promoting monoculture plantations and GE food crops. It's easy to think those objections are just inherited from traditionally anti-corporate Western environmentalists, but there have been significant issues in recent Philippines history of top-down control of agriculture. In the mid-1980s, rice monopolies under the dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr. were widely seen to leave rural communities impoverished. Farmers protested policies at the time and were violently repressed by the military in return. Subsequent promises of reform were made, but largely were not acted upon. It didn't help, therefore, when in 2013 golden rice was introduced in one community that had said that it didn't want it, and apparently had been told that it wouldn't be planted there. This led to a group of around 400 protesters attacking and destroying that trial plot, and it all fed into a background of suspicion and fear, which has made the current debate that much more fraught. One thing that does seem to be the case, the campaigners are right that golden rice is seen as the first step in the growth of GM crop technology promotion. A number of scientists argue that this is a good thing, not to be considered nefarious in the slightest. So, for example, in 2016, more than 150 Nobel laureates signed an open letter attacking Greenpeace for campaigning against golden rice and other GM crops. They charged that the campaign group had, quote, misrepresented the risks, benefits and impacts of genetically altered food plants. In spite of a number of years passing now, during which GM crops have been widely used in a number of countries, the open letter noted this: there has never been a single confirmed case of a negative health outcome for humans or animals from their consumption. And this case also challenges the campaigners' use of the so-called precautionary principle, which taken in that way would simply mean that no novel technique could ever be developed or followed, since proving a negative, proving that it causes zero harm, is generally not possible. Their argument was that a rational, pragmatic approach to solving such problems should be able to benefit from modern technological developments that might help, which had shown good value in real-life usage for a number of years already. However, one thing that is clear is that such claims for pragmatism first need to overcome what is clearly a very hard-fought point of principle. The battle lines that are drawn are more solidly based on values than they are on rational assessments of pros and cons. And right now, it's by no means certain which way this particular fight will ultimately play out and what will be the consequences, particularly for those children who are currently dying from vitamin A deficiency. My thanks as always to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Without that support, these videos could not be made. If you would like to add yours, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. See you next time.